here with Nick Jaworski. Nick, before we roll into anything, first, thanks for joining me. I appreciate you and your time and the things that you're doing. Hoping that you could give a little bit of background on yourself, besides maybe anything I just listed, which would be like keynotes and bullet points. But before you do, I'll just say that my interest in you, well, you're constantly posting somewhere, whether it's like a blog or a podcast or if it's on social media, and it's always valuable. And so I got to give you that. Like you talk about wide-ranging things, but my general sense is that you're a systems-wide, or at least a constructive systems thinker. You see a bigger picture, and you've mapped that onto something practical in your work. And of course, I'm interested in the stuff that you do with, let's call it recovery or treatment or therapeutic systems, and trying to point out those organizations that are honest and are giving value, and trying to improve those spaces. So anyway, that's my interest, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you got into it and what you do on a day-to-day.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. I mean, I really appreciate having me on. I'm sure we'll have kind of a wide-ranging conversation here. So I guess just an intro as it relates to behavioral health is there's a couple things that I do. One is kind of how I got into the space is actually through Stanton Peele. So I went through addiction treatment myself when I was 18 or 19, got some DUIs, and I'm like, what is going on in these counseling sessions? None of this makes sense, right? And I couldn't find anything really valuable in the research. I'm a researcher. I like to write. I like data. So as I dug into things, I finally came across Stanton's work, The Diseasing of America. And I'm like, this is it. This is the guy. So that stuck with me for years. I became a teacher, and that's actually where some of your comments around the writing is. I like to write. I like to teach, and I'm always interested in different perspectives. Right. And so I like to share those perspectives and see what other people's kind of counterpoints or perspectives are on things. So I tend to be fairly prolific in that sense. And then anyway, so I ran school systems, did teacher training internationally for about a decade, schools in Turkey, Vietnam, the US, China, came back to the US, left education and moved into the marketing realm, and then got into behavioral health. And so that happened, kind of two pieces coming together. One, we started working with behavioral health providers kind of out of the gate. That was a bit random. But two was me remembering kind of my experience in treatment, and it was a pretty negative experience, very ineffective, at least for me, and definitely some other people in the room as well. And so I wanted to help, I wanted to improve it. And then as we dug into what I found from a marketing aspect, there's a lot of shady stuff that happens, which we can dig into. So that was really upsetting to me. So I tried to create an organization that was committed to helping people. And so through the marketing messaging that we have through our clients, everything we do is value added, right? How do we help people think about addiction differently, really understand kind of multimodal causality, and then look at actual practical advice, things that they can use in their daily life, a lot like you guys do with the Life Process program, right? So we've got that. Then I built out a consulting wing of that business, and we go in and work with providers. So I've been in over 100 group sessions, providers across the country, all levels of care, looking at from an operational standpoint, how do we help the business get better, connect patients to quality care, and make their experience easier and better in the facilities. And then I recently launched a third wing of that business where we certify therapists, and I'm combining my education world with the behavioral health world. And so I know you've got that background as well, right? And I couldn't figure it out for a bit, but I always wanted to fix what was broken in the treatment program that I went to. And that's broken in almost everywhere. I mean, of the 100 plus programs I've been in, they're almost all the same, and they're almost all lacking in the same way. And so I said, well, I'm not a therapist, but I do have this training skill set, and that applies to the therapeutic room, right? If I'm doing a therapeutic intervention, I have to engage all the patients. Most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're bored out of their minds, and one person's talking and the other 12 are not paying attention. And it's not skill set focused. So a lot of what happens within the therapy session is just chat, and that's not even a value judgment that's statistically validated. Like Dr. Kathleen Carroll at Yale did a lot of research on CBT engagements and found that 80% of it was just chat. So that's really what happens. There's no real therapeutic intervention happening. And it's because they're not building skills. So they're just talking. It's didactic. I mean, you have to have some explanation happening, to have learning happen. But the vast majority of learning, if I'm trying to swim, I can't listen to a teacher talk about it. If I'm trying to learn another language, I can't learn it by reading a book about that language, right? I have to do these things. I have to get on the bike and ride. And so we've created a certification, and it's all, approved and accredited by ACADA and the other related entities in different states. And so we're teaching them how to provide really effective treatment interventions using adult learning theory and educational kind of frameworks.
That's fascinating. So I think I might even need to back up a little bit, because you're talking about, I presume you're talking about taking intelligent, well-meaning therapists who want to engage further and do better and help them deal with their clients in an experiential skills-based, skills-building way. Before that, you mentioned that you went to treatment centers yourself, or counseling yourself, and saw either no value or little value in it, or maybe it was even doing more harm than good. I'm interested in what that was like for you and what you found out about that.
Sure. So there was a couple of pieces that didn't work for me. One, the perspective of addiction as a disease just was not valuable for me, especially at that time in my life. I was a young kid. I was successful in other areas of my life, and so it didn't make sense to me that I couldn't take any positive action and make improvement in my own life. I'm not overly religious. I grew up in a Catholic home, but it's not a core part of my identity, I would say. And so that didn't jive well with me. And it was very framed in a very religious manner, very AA 12-step oriented. And it just kind of bothered me, the lack of engagement from the people in the room. So most people in the room were like me. They had a DUI or something and were court ordered to be there. But there were a couple of people that weren't, and that were very serious about getting help. And they just were not getting it. You could just tell that it wasn't happening within that setting. The counselor wasn't very well trained. She had like a year certification. She had just been to recovery herself a year before that. So not a lot of experience, not a lot of training, just one by one around the room, and like, how are you today? How are you today? Tell me about your relapse trigger. Tell me about your relapse trigger. Let's watch Bill W for the next 2 hours. It was just really ineffective. And so that made me feel bad, because I'm like, okay, I don't care, because I'm not super involved in this process, but I see people that want to be, and they're not getting much out of it, and then we had that big differentiation between, now you got dual diagnosis co-occurring disorders, kind of a standard mentality in the space, but back then it was all separate. So I remember we had this one woman, Tammy. She was pretty abused in a very abusive relationship, and she would start to talk about it, and the counselor would say, Tammy, we're not here to talk about your relationship. We're here to talk about your addiction. You can talk about your relationship, with your therapist. And just this complete disconnect, right, between the fact that the abuse at home was clearly central to her drinking, and so all of that really bothered me.
It's always been interesting to me that I work in school systems too. I hate the title. It's behavioral specialist. I'm by no means a behaviorist. If anything, I'm like-minded in the way that it's important to build skills and experiences. But the way that people think about, you can silo people's problems by, by discipline. It's an insane thing to think. If you really, any argument, it breaks apart, but early on, if you try to explain it that way. But anyway, I digress, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir. I'm really interested in what your experiences have been, especially since looking into it. I'm trying to think about where I want to start. Sorry. You talked about marketing and then this space that you're in, behavioral health. Mm-hmm. And I think some people find that icky, like the idea that you could be marketing behavioral health, like they shouldn't coincide.
Yeah.
I disagree with it, maybe because I have skin in the game, but that's something I try to reconcile sometimes. So maybe I put a placeholder there, because I'm interested first in what, scams and bad practices in terms of marketing that you've seen therapeutic programs use Because I think that's maybe what's putting the bad taste in people's mouths.
Sure. Well, I mean, people have a bad taste around marketing in general, right? They kind of have this assumption that it's sleazy. They think of like a used car salesman, even when they think of marketing, right? And that does happen, as we'll talk about quickly here with the treatment providers, but good marketing is connected to the mission. You have to connect patients to quality care. And if people don't know, we run marketing for the entire state of South Carolina for all other behavioral health agencies. And the constant complaint, and the reason they came to us is that, hey, they said, none of the residents know we're here. We've been here for 50 years. We've got 36 agencies across the state. Nobody knows we exist. Nobody's seeking care. And obviously it's not nobody, but not nearly as many as they would hope, considering the fact that they've been in the community forever. So you have to do good marketing. Now from our perspective, to do it right, you have to add value, right? How do you help people through that message? Because 99% of people that see a marketing message don't need services today, right? But how can you still help them in their lives by giving them tips on dealing with a loved one or dealing with a personal situation or just knowing that options exist, right? Is a big component of it. But then the other piece for us is making sure that there's integrity and alignment with the clinical programming. And that's the other disconnect that a lot of people generally don't like about marketing is a marketer will come and say, hey, this is the best coaster you can buy. It's made out of 100% pure blah, 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 right? Well, you have to be honest and say, hey, this is what we do. This is what we're good at. This is why you should come to us. And as long as you have integrity and alignment with what you actually provide, it's great. So what we have to help programs with a lot is they're siloed. Their marketing team's over here and their clinical team's over here, and they don't talk. And so the marketing team is tasked with getting people connected to care, and they do a whole bunch of things to try and do that. But then there's disalignment, right? Because the patient comes in and they're like, well, I read this one thing, but that's not what I got in the program, because they're not integrated. So we often work with providers on that level. And then when we work with them as the outsourced marketing team, right, then we're always in constant contact with the executive team, the clinical team. That's why we observe the clinical programs ourselves before we start marketing for a lot of clients. So that piece is there. And then specifically to what you're talking about with the shady stuff, we can probably put a link in the podcast if you want. We have a whole article on it, but primarily you have patient brokering was the number one. Literally people would just cruise down Delray Beach or Costa Mesa, California, and they were just like, hey man, you got insurance? You got insurance? And they'd literally go into these areas where drug users were known to, basically hang out, see if they had insurance, and then give them kickbacks, right? So they say, hey, look, if you come into the treatment, we'll give you free cigarettes, we got Xboxes, you got all the food you can eat, and we'll even give you $500. Just come to our treatment center, stay there. And then the treatment center would pay the body broker, right, a cut of the fee too, because they were making insane amounts of money when addiction treatment first got approval through the Mental Health Parity Act. Suddenly you were getting paid $60,000 a month for someone in a residential level of care. It only costs, $8,000 to deliver treatment for a level of residential 30-day stay. So they were making crazy amounts of money. And so you had a lot of shady people that got pulled into it. Florida in particular often has this whole group of people that bounce from shady business to shady business. So unfortunately, addiction treatment was one of those. But then you had a whole dynamic that came into play there. So as that parity came into play and all this money flowed into addiction treatment with no licensing, no regulation, no nothing, right? I could literally hang a shingle and start selling residential treatment. The opioid crisis really hit with all the overdoses. And so you had these moms that were terrified, right? I mean, back in the 70s, if I caught my kid smoking pot or coming home drunk, I'm upset. We're going to have conversations maybe, but I'm not going to ship them off to treatment program, right? But heroin or prescription pills, I'm freaking out because I'm hearing all this stuff on the news. So you were shipping all these kids off to treatment. They didn't really want to be there, right? They didn't really care. A lot of them, they were kids and they just got caught using drugs. And most people, they'll probably drop the habit by 25, 26, right? But they would go into treatment, they didn't care. And so the providers, this was the perfect storm. The providers didn't care about providing good care. The patients didn't care about getting good care. And then everyone figured out the insurance game and they realized that their insurance was basically a credit card. And so even the patients facilitated the process, right? And they'd go, okay, well, look, man, I could go to your treatment center or the treatment center over there. That treatment center is going to give me a free Xbox. What are you going to give me, right? So you created this really negative kind of feedback loop. It was just a bad storm. But then you had patient brokering, you had people that would, so you have a lot of good providers around the country, obviously, as well. There's just kind of these small segments that had these negative practices, but they had so much money behind them that they were literally spending $1 million a month on marketing. Like a lot of these guys were spending $1 million a month on marketing. So reaching a lot of people across the country, and they would like copy Hazelton's ads, for example, and then run them as Hazelton's ads, but replace the number and it would ship to their center. Or you get a lot of people running like hotline scams, so a lot of the online websites that used to rank when we first started getting into the space was just a lead aggregator. And unfortunately, a lot of the larger treatment providers owned these lead aggregators. So you had marketers doing it, you had programs doing it. And you'd call and they'd just say admissions, and they know who they were talking to, and they would just sell that number to the highest bidder, right? So a lot of shady stuff. You still see some of it. It's much reduced from what it used to be, a lot more regulation in place. But people will even still, like if you look at Google My Businesses in the area, if you search for addiction treatment near me, I guarantee you there's gonna be at least one or two that are fake treatment centers. They're not real, they don't really exist. You'll call, they'll say something like admissions, and then they'll say something like, oh, you're looking for X center? Actually, they're full. Have you considered coming to Florida? And then they'll try to shuffle you down, into their system. So lots of unsavory practices.
So you have, you just sort of described a spectrum since we've been talking, from bad faith and bad treatment to maybe bad faith and there's some good employers in your treatment center, or all the way to good faith and good practice and want to improve. Where do you fit in best? Where are you most valuable in doing an overhaul of the more shady bad faith systems, or are you more interested in the prospective people who want to do well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's evolved over time. So we have a very good brand within the recovery space, meaning we have a good reputation. People know what we do and what we don't do. So people know that we won't work with shady providers. And so we don't even get those calls anymore, but that took time to build up, right? So we were very adamant. We had screens in place to, just kind of walk people through how they did their marketing, how they thought about their business. And if they weren't the right provider, we just wouldn't work with them. So the initial goal of Circle Social when I first started it was to help the good providers become better, because they were getting beat out. A lot of the good providers had been built by clinicians, therapists, people in recovery that were really passionate about helping others, but they didn't know how to run a business. They didn't know how to market, right? So we sought out those particular providers and then helped them compete with these other guys who tended not to care about the clinical program, but knew how to run a business and knew how to market, right? Over time, that's changed. I think in two ways. One, most of the fields become on the up and up. So all of the big providers, the large providers across the country, all of those are really well run these days. They're really focused on providing good clinical care. Not saying that that's easy to do, but they're definitely trying to do it, right? And so we work with a lot of them. We work with actually most of the larger providers across the country at this point. But we will also, and this is rarer, but we will have some providers that reach out to us and say, hey, look, we know who you are, we know what you do, we know who you work with. And being really upfront, we used to operate that way, but we want to change. We want to be better. Will you help us? And we've done that twice now. Both times that's happened, it was younger guys. So literally people that were 23 years old were building these treatment centers and suddenly making $1 million a year, and these were people in recovery and maybe they just got out of jail, right? They were still in a certain mindset. So as they got older and as the field evolved and as they really sat down and said, hey, actually, I do really want to help people. I don't think I was doing that. They will reach out to us. So it's a mix of all of those at this point.
Something that came up just now for me, and it's philosophical, not practical in terms of our conversation. Curious your take on this. It's been a bone of contention between me and among me and other people I work with. What do you think about court orders? If you're consulting with a business, I don't know, what's your gut reaction about taking court order treatment, and how do you parse it? For instance, I think you know where I'm going with it. I'm in terms of a business model, it's almost like, well, if that's somebody who's going to pay money and they're court ordered and they need the thing, well, maybe that could be good for business. On the other hand, if you're truly providing value, then you have to ask yourself, how much of what I'm doing am I going to try to impose on this person, or
Yeah.
how much value am I really giving to the larger community by, engaging with this person or the court system in general? What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say from like a business or a marketing standpoint, we don't get into it. I don't ask clients if they're taking court order or not taking court order. But philosophically, I guess there's two pieces. Like just from a gut reaction standpoint, I'm not a huge fan of forcing people into treatment, right? I think that you can strongly encourage people. I think there's value there. I don't know about forcing. I mean, if you look at the research, right, it's just been shifting. So the research used to say that it really didn't matter whether they were voluntarily in treatment or forced into treatment. The success rates were about the same. But that's recently come under fire, right? And very recently, the research has been saying that actually that's not the case, which makes a lot more sense to me. You have to have a desire and a motivation to change. And can you find that motivation inside treatment? Sure. I mean, if I'm drunk all day, every day, I don't really have the headspace to even think about what my life could be like sober, right? So if I'm forced to become sober and then I've got this opportunity to think about it, I see other people that are making changes in their lives. There's definitely potential there. So I definitely don't think it's all bad. My preference would be if people were able to voluntarily do it. I think where I have the biggest concerns is like, where the police so in certain states, your family can basically commit you, right? That kind of bothers me. If you go into a court situation and they say, hey, look, you got two options. You can sit 2 years in jail or you can go through treatment. What do you want? That's more amenable on my end, but it's like when the family just says, hey, we're going to force this person to go. I think they could do that better,
I'm going to keep us in the weeds for one more question. This is kind of selfish. I'm interested in your more philosophical musings from you, because there's another question in line with that. Something staff and I have also been discussing recently is whether MAT, well, I guess formerly MAT, now it's more popularly called MOUD, medication for opioid use disorder, whether having that on the table in terms of a court order is coercive. It's an interesting question because to me, there's only one right answer, but I've told you this before, I'm trying my best to let my own emotions and intuitions to be more open about perspectives. And so actually this is Maya Solovitz and I had an argument about this, and
Sure.
her take is that, she's been pushing for the ability just for people to get medication for a long time. And it's been a bugaboo of hers that people see it in a bad light just because it's drugs.
Yeah.
And so she has this, I'm not trying to get you to argue against me or Maya, but she has this idea that since it's a third option on the table, there's nothing coercive about it. And, even if I say to her, well, what if a person has three options, jail, traditional treatment, or MOUD? And if they choose MOUD, is there nothing coercive about that? And she's kind of like, not at all. There is no coercion there. It would be if there were two options, but it's not if it's the third one on the table. I can't do the calculus there, but it seems like there's two factions. So just curious. This is just like a total impromptu question for you, but I like the way you think about it. So
I think there's degrees of anything, right? I try not to be too black and white on stuff. And so in my ideal world, it's purely voluntary, right? But having options is better than having no options too, right? So at least you're getting options, and having three options is better than two. So I'd say, there's degrees of value there. But my ideal world would, be voluntary. I think there is value to that argument though, too, right? Like throwing someone in jail, that is definitely not valuable, right? And especially like if you look at adolescents, so this, right? All the data around adolescents. If you take an adolescent that is struggling in their life and having behavior or anti-disestablishment issues, right, and put them in with a bunch of other people like them, that makes it worse. The best you can do for that kid is get him in with a bunch of straight A students and have them somehow work together, right? Yeah. I think jail is often a bad answer. So diverting people out of that system is probably for the best.
Okay, I'll let you off the hook with that. That's a totally fair analysis, and kind of leaving something on the table. But okay, so I'm interested to know what you see as quality therapy, and there's going to be so many lanes we could take this. First of all, I think this could get us into it. You talked about a disconnect sometimes between marketing for organizations and clinical. So the actual valuable thing an organization might have, or I guess it's up for debate whether it could be valuable or not, whether it aligns with marketing, the promise. Um, it's going to depend on whether a clinical team is able to do a self-evaluation about what they're doing and how they want to build or how they treat clients, and then an ability for someone on the marketing side to be able to communicate with that team. And so yeah, talk to me about that process, maybe blind spots that you see people have and how you reconcile those things.
So we can look at it, maybe let's use a couple concrete examples. A real easy one that comes up with us all the time is someone will say, hey, we want to market to LGBTQ because we believe that, they need treatment and there's a lot of people in our geographic area or whatever. And I'll say, great, what's the program like? And they'll say, oh, well, we don't have one yet. We want to see if people have interest. I'm like, no. I said, well, we're not going to do that. I said, if you guys want to market your own stuff, that's up to you. But we're not going to market a program that doesn't exist, because that's exactly what we're talking about with disalignment, right? You're telling people that you have a specialized program for them. They get in, they're just thrown in the general program, and then they're upset. And so that's a problem clinically. It's also a problem from the business end, right? Because if you go in and you get something different than what you expected, then you're upset. So you have a bad experience. You tell everyone about your bad experience. You post bad online reviews. So the only thing it does is hurt the patient, and then it actually hurts your business, because over time, if you keep doing that, you'll rack up so many negative reviews that people will stop coming. And we literally see that. I mean, we track all the data. We have a ridiculous amount of data. And so if you have less than a 4-star review for your treatment program, you will literally pay 20% more as a cost per call and a cost per admission from a marketing standpoint, because less people are calling, right? They see the reviews, they check it, they say, I'm not going to call, right? So that's one option or one example. Another example is when you look at things like dual diagnosis or evidence-based care or 12-step facilitation. Your 12-step works really well for a certain set of people, and it does not work for other people, right? And then you can say the same thing about different types of programs. Some people really want a faith-based program. They find a lot of value in that. Some people do not. And so if you're marketing something that's different, and we'll see that a lot. So a lot of people have tried to shift their marketing more towards evidence-based care, dual diagnosis, even when they've got a real core 12-step program that they're philosophically very bought into. For them, we're like, look, that's the wrong approach. You are who you are. You should not be trying to cast this net where you're trying to get everyone in, right? You should be saying, who can we help the best? And these are the people that you can help the best. And these are who you should be messaging to. Related to that, we were doing one that they were willing to do faith-based marketing, but they wanted to do generic faith-based marketing. They're like, well, we'll help anyone. I said, well, sure. I said, look, you've been around 60 years. How many non-Christians have come into your program? And they're like, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know if we've ever had. I mean, have you ever had a Muslim? Have you had a Jew? Have you ever had a Buddhist? I don't think so. So then why, clearly your audience and your core skill set clinically is to help people from a Christian faith-based background. So let's say that's what we do, so that disconnect happens. And then I'd say the final disconnect is just generally in terms of very broadly what treatment is delivered. So a lot of people talk about evidence-based treatment, but most of the time they're using it as buzzwords. If you ask the clinicians what evidence-based treatment means, they'll just be like, oh, well, the evidence-based things. I'm like, well, what? They're like, well, like CBT, DBT. It's like, okay, well, how are you integrating it into the program? How are you tailoring that to particular patients? It is pretty fluffy, and it's not the therapist's fault. I think, which we can get into. They're not trained on it, right? I mean, the training that you get in your bachelor's program and even your master's and your licensing is really just bookish. There's a lot of theory. And so when you're put into the real world and you have to help someone struggle through a real problem, you're just going off of book teachings and what you've seen other people do, which tends to be very didactic and just chatty. So those disconnects happen. So we try to help them understand who they are clinically, right? Who they should be trying to reach and who they can help the best. And then we will help them kind of define their clinical strengths. And so that's part of the reason we'll watch the groups is we'll say, hey, look, this is what you seem to be really good at, right? You were really great with younger crowd. The therapists that you had, they seem to really connect with that audience, so we would recommend trying to connect with, younger individuals looking for treatment, something like that.
That's interesting that you talked about people kind of wrapping a label around whatever thing that they're doing, but sometimes without even having a program that exists. It's funny that you had to reflect, I can't market for a program that doesn't exist. But You did mention like the buzzword of the year or whatever. People will say that's the thing we are, and hope when people come into it, they find that they're every bit as valuable as the buzzword that they hoped that they would get. But I do believe that there are people who do. I think there are some people who do great therapy and couldn't even explain why what they're doing is great. And then there are people who do, very vanilla, standard, maybe or maybe not helpful therapy, who could only explain to you what they're doing through, I don't know, whatever the standard boxes are that they learned about in their master's program or licensing program. What do you think makes a great therapist or great therapy?
So, the research is super clear on it. Right? It's really just Therapeutic Alliance. Is there a connection between the therapist and the patient, and there's their trust and empathy that's being built? And at the end of the day, the clinical modality that they're using is almost irrelevant. And that's been super clear in the research for a long time. That's why I say it's so important that there's this connection between, the type of care that they're delivering and what the patient's looking for, because that's going to help establish that motivation component. I think that's most important for me. The other piece, like with the new program or the new certification that we created, is the skill set building, right? And the level of engagement. So the vast majority of groups, probably almost all of your listeners can speak to this. If you're sitting in a group, they just go around the room, you say, hey, how was your day? Or what was the relapse trigger that you have? Or, they got their question for the day. Well, if I've got 10 people in that room and we each get 5 minutes to talk, that's 50 minutes gone. And I talked about myself for 5 minutes. It was just random. It was random conversation, right? There was no back and forth. There was no therapeutic intervention. There was no support. It was just talking for 5 minutes. So when you run a really good group, and this is the way that I used to teach my teachers to run a really good classroom, right? Is every single person's engaged all the time. Even simple things. Let's say that you're watching a video. Let's say that they want to show a clip from Bill W. Right? Fine. What's the purpose there? First, what's your objective? What are you trying to get out of that? Right? And then second, what task are you giving them beforehand so that you're focusing them to get that learning component that you want out of it, but also you're making sure that they're engaged, right? So now I'm not just watching the video and probably sleeping because I have no reason to watch it. I have to answer these questions, or I have to come up with some feedback, or I have to come up with a role play, whatever it is, there's got to be some value component there. And same thing when other people are talking, it says, okay, look, I'll ask everyone a question and I won't call a name, right? And so why don't I call a name? Because I want everyone to think that maybe I'm going to call on them. So I now have the entire patient population engaged, thinking about the answer because they don't know if they're going to get asked or not, right? And then I give them a focus task. I'll say, okay, look, I'm going to ask this question, but I want you all to come up with a response to what John says, right? And so again, they're not checking out when John starts talking, they're engaged because they have to actually think about what he's doing. So that kind of stuff is important. And then from the skill building standpoint, that's what I see missing in almost all of the clinical groups that I watch, is they're not learning to swim. They're not getting them in the water. They're not getting them on the bike, whatever the situation is, they're not getting the recovery skills. So if I want to teach someone how to restructure negative thoughts, if I want to teach them how to, create incremental goals, right? If I want to, walk through cognitive distortions and how to really deal with those, or create a discharge plan, or create a relapse trigger plan, right? I have to do that over and over again because great learning is unconscious, right? When I swim, I'm not thinking about putting this arm over this and breathing. If I'm on a bike, I'm not thinking about, the centripetal force and where my hands are and how I'm balancing and how I'm breathing, right? It's all automated. So really good learning is an unconscious process that happens through habituated repetition, right? And you're doing the same thing with thought processes and behaviors. And so if I want to get on to a new neural pathway or create a new neural network, right, and move away from this one that's been destructive in my life, maybe I've got use or problematic use, well, I've got to work really hard, it's like, I can't go to a gym and then drop 50 pounds the first day I go there, right? It's going to take me 30, 60, 90, a year plus to really accomplish my goals. Mental health is the same way, moving away from addiction, depression, anxiety, it's the same thing. And so you have to maximize not just the engagement, but the repetition that's happening to produce the skills that you want. So not only do I understand it intellectually, but it's unconsciously automated. So when I face that relapse trigger in my life, I default to that neural network and not my old one.
So you describe, I'm not using I'm not using similar terms to yours, but something like attunement to the population that to the milieu, to your clients, so that you can decide which skills are actually salient in their lives. You wouldn't work on some sort of a dialectic therapy if that had nothing to do with what either motivates them or what besets them. So being able to be aligned and in tune. Do you have strategies that you use? And I know I'm getting specific here, but it's just what interests me. For people who want to do that and think they're doing that and don't realize that they're really not, they're not getting in touch at any sort of a deep level with the people, with their clients. But what strategies do you have for your clients, people who are therapists and go through the certification to take the next step there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So like the way that we run the certification is exactly the way that we expect them to deliver the therapeutic session, right? So it's very, very involved. It's very up and moving and engaging. They constantly have to be doing what we do, practice for them. And so we do it step by step. And so let's say, well, I mean, we can just start with examples. How do we create objectives, right? What does a good objective look like? We'll talk about it, for less than 10% of that particular session. And then they'll practice it, right? I'll have them work in small pairs and groups, come up with a number of different objectives. Then they share it between each other, give each other feedback, right? And then we'll go and say, okay, well, now I want you to plan your session for tomorrow, come up with your objective for tomorrow, and then same thing, right? So they prepare for the lesson that day or the next day. If we're doing cognitive restructuring or if we're doing I statements or whatever, again, same thing. We'll actually get up and do that and role play those with the people in the room. And we'll show them how to set up small group work, the whole group, back to small group, to review, to feedback, right? So it's a very involved process where they're actually expected to do it. And so to your question, that's where they get the gaps, right? Because when you see people doing it, you can see what they're doing well and what they're struggling with. And so then now I can tailor my delivery and my interventions to what's needed. So not only am I getting a general sense of how well I actually got the thing across, because I can see if they're able to do it or not, I can see their general level, and then I can determine what we're going to do next session or tomorrow. And then I can also pinpoint, particular individuals that seem to be struggling. And even from a classroom or a therapy management standpoint, I can pair the right people. I say, okay, John's been here for 30 days and he's really getting it. And Andrea's new, and so she's really struggling. So I'm going to pair John and Andrea together for the next pair work session, right? So you learn how to structure the therapy session to maximize individuals' kind of strengths and weaknesses together. And then also, if you're really facilitating well, it allows you to hone in on and identify what your opportunities for improvement are, what their opportunities for improvement are, and tailor effectively.
Do you have, because you mentioned the term sobriety or people who are using drugs or drinking actively. What are your thoughts around harm reduction, and to what level do you accept clients who are working in the harm reduction space? Just so that listeners understand what I mean by that. Like I as you mentioned, using a brand to call it, trying to brand yourself something that really you're not. I see a lot of people with the harm reduction label who are an abstinence-based treatment facility. Sometimes it's just by virtue of litigation that they do that what they can get away with. But versus a totally rogue, so to speak, place where it said, use any drug you want anytime you want under the auspices of this care, and then we'll work from there. Do you have a line in the sand or a way of?
Yeah. So from the beginning, when we started Circle Social, like philosophically, we are very much about the way that we think about treatment is to help someone get out of an addiction or behavioral problem, you have to understand how they got into it. Mm-hmm. So each person needs to have that tailored individually as much as possible, given the constraints of the program and reimbursement and all that kind of stuff. So we are very much advocates of multiple pathways to recovery. I think, I'm on the board for Above and Beyond Recovery Center, right, in Chicago. And that's the philosophy that we operate under. Some people come in and they find it really valuable. Some people are really like SMART. Some people really like Dharma. Some people really want to be in age specific groups or gender specific. Some people don't. We try to create an environment where they're able to go to the thing that fits them the best. And that's definitely what I do when I'm working with people in the field as well. And when we used to push people, like when I first started, so you can break it into areas of the country too. So if I'm a treatment program in Tennessee, running a 12-step program is generally a pretty smart idea. It's very faith-based. People are very familiar with AA. They tend to like the approach. If I go out to California or Washington, AA is generally not the best program to be running. People are not super interested in that style of treatment. They don't find it very valuable. Executives are another good example. Executives tend to not prefer alternative to 12-step programs. Adolescents are the same, right? For a whole host of different reasons. So we really push people to say, hey, what are you good at first, right? So what are you good at? And then what does the patient population in your area or that you're serving need and benefit from the most? So philosophically, we're very open. If you get specifically into harm reduction, I think there's such a wide variance of the way that people approach it. And so like we work with a lot of MAT clinics, and that's an interesting struggle for a couple of reasons. So one, a lot of people that build the programs, like you said, are kind of abstinence oriented, right? And so they're running this MAT program with the goal of abstinence, and so fine, it's your program, but my perspective is, look, not everyone's gonna want abstinence or sobriety, right? There are people that are going to be on an MAT protocol for a long time. Methadone programs in particular, people don't want to get off. It's just the kind of people that go into a methadone program have really oftentimes have no interest of tapering down or getting off the protocol at any point. Suboxone is a little bit different. People are much more willing to taper there. But, a lot of programs, generally, and this is real data when we look at the patient volume, because they all do urine screens for everyone that comes in every time, right? So about 50% of them are using something, right? A lot of people in the MAT program just want to get off the opioids. They're sick of the rat race of feeling sick and then scrambling to get money and scrambling to get the drugs, and it becomes unmanageable in their lives. But they have no problem using meth or drinking or smoking pot, and a lot of time that's what their family's doing. That's what their friend network is doing. A lot of people are on Medicaid. They literally have nowhere to go. It's very, very challenging. A lot of barriers and obstacles to getting out of that lifestyle. If I'm living in a holler in Kentucky and I didn't complete high school, it's not so easy for me to change my life, or especially distance myself from the family and friends I've known my entire life, right? And so if they're all using and you're asking me to be completely sober and abstinent in that setting, well, then I basically have to leave that family group, but I literally can't. They're there. I don't have transportation, right? I don't have a job. I don't have an education. Where am I going to go? So that's a challenge for a number of our providers. It's a challenge for a lot of the therapists. So when I talk to the therapists, they come in with the mindset that a lot of them come from residential care. So they're expecting to see like some kind of progress in 30 days. And like, that's not how it works in an MAT program. We're talking about 1 year, 2 year minimum timelines here to even get people really interested in exploring different life opportunities and styles. And then two, this whole idea that, they're going to probably continue to use. They want to get off the opioids. 50% are happy to drop everything, but 50% really have no interest whatsoever. And so what we tell the therapists is we say, hey, look, if you have this particular kind of idea of what you think an ideal life looks like, you're more than welcome to engage that person as they come in, and maybe eventually they'll come around to your way of thinking, who knows, right? But you have to be willing to accept the fact that their goals are different from your goals. And if you really want to help this person, we take a very strong motivational interviewing approach, right? A lot of times, so if you want to help this person, what are their goals? Help them achieve their goals. And if you can align their goals with what you think is the right approach, the more the merrier, but start with them. Don't start with your preconceptions or your judgments.
Yeah, well said. Bringing that all together, like there are going to be areas with a significant underclass, so to speak. I don't know if that's a judgmental way of speaking, but you know what I mean. It gets the point across. And first of all, to bring all of this into one square, it's hard to market. Well, except for Medicaid, it's difficult to market to that milieu because they're the very people who don't, they're not going to pony up for the kind of service you want to provide. So it's hard to be a for-profit in that space. And so I imagine it's also hard to find, to give quality care in that space. MAT has been good for those purposes. And then again, I've visited a lot of programs. She did an investigative report in Arizona. There's a place with the first 24-hour methadone. I think
Community Medical Services. Yep.
And Nick.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that wound up being just a great place. They had an answer for a lot of the questions that I had. And so anyway, but there were some places that I visited that, there were so many contradictions. Like, first of all, and you sort of mentioned this, like the idea that to be able to continue to access your medication, there is a person that you're serving that now has to do a million of the things that they didn't have the skills to do in the first place and continue to do it, or else it's, a strike against them. So showing up to a place on time, having a urine screen analysis that's free of all drugs, and then people are often kicked out of that center, and then and then on the other hand, it's the only game in town. So what do you think about? Do you have any creative ideas about how to provide quality care to people in that space, and make that sustainable? Be able to sidestep some of the hurdles that people will necessarily go through.
Yeah.
To be able to provide service to them.
So the way that we think about it is, how can you remove obstacles and barriers to care? And so like a 3-strike policy, which is common in a lot of MAT providers, to us is a barrier to care, right? But that brings back to your question about how people view harm reduction, the politics around it, right? Because it's hard to get support from the jail system, from the court system, from law enforcement. If you don't have some of these punitive models, they're like, well, you can't just let people keep using.
Yeah.
So that's the mentality a lot of people come to. And so sometimes there's that balance that you have to create where it's like, look, we're trying to help people, but we're also trying to make sure we have community support and acceptance so we can help people. And so you got to figure that out. And I think Community Medical Services does a fabulous job of creating those relationships and building them and working with people. I mean, Nick spends a lot of time and money that has nothing to do with patient acquisition or revenue, just to educate the community, right? And that's I really love their program. So we talk about removing access and say removing barriers. How can you remove barriers? And then when we think about that, one of those is like, okay, kicking people out for negative urine screens is a big one. What matters to these patients? So as you said, like from a marketing perspective, we don't run TV advertisements or Facebook advertising for MAT providers. We do search engine optimization and some Google ads. Why? Because that's search intent driven. So for most Medicaid patients, I seek care at the moment of need. I know I'm going to be sick in the next 48 hours and I don't want to be sick. And I can't find drugs, or I'm sick of my life and I want to change something. Yeah. I'm going to Google an MAT provider, and a Suboxone doctor half the time is a big search term. And then they'll find it and they'll go in. Right. So when we work with providers, like a lot of providers will say, well, we provide comprehensive care and we're holistic and blah, blah, blah. I said, your patients don't care. They don't care about all of these other services you're offering. They want to know, can you offer me service? How fast, and what's it going to cost me? Those are the only 3 things they care about. So we work a lot with clients on that messaging and say, hey, look, I understand that you want to be this really holistic care program and that's important to you, but it's not important to your patients. So marketing message, talk to what's important to them. And then as they get into your program, now you can start having these other conversations. Now you can say, okay, look, you really like this program, right? Your life is getting better. Have you thought about getting a job? Have you thought about our care coordinator over here or a case manager that can help you with DCS and maybe get your kids back, right? Have you thought about, so from our perspective, it's really about incrementally engaging them in care as appropriate. You have to remove the barriers first. And a really good example, so another good provider in Ohio is Brightview. And what they did, and they tried to do IOP programming right out the gate. And they were pushing people in the IOP program. They said, okay, look, based on your ASAM assessment here, your severity levels, you need to go into IOP. Well, what happened is most of the patients just never showed up again, right? And so it clicked for them, and they said, well, look, if we're not helping them at all, then why are we even doing this? So then they switched gears and started working with the patient, right? And they said, okay, well, we would think IOP would be best here based on this clinical assessment that we have. Are you willing to do it? No. Okay, what level of care are you willing to do? Okay, we'll engage you where you're at, right? And we'll start with you. And then if you're happy with things and things are working and we can get you an IOP, yeah, we're going to encourage that. But we're not going to force you or set that as a barrier to treatment that you have to do this, level of care that we're assigning you. So for me, it's all about meeting people where they're at, understanding their objectives, and then, going slow when appropriate.
Given that the work that you do is with providers that run the gamut, depending on location and overall philosophy, their clientele, what is a good framework that you've adopted or created or thought about for what success means? I'll be totally honest and vulnerable right now. I'm trying to figure out the best way to do that for my program. And I'm not trying to just solicit wholesale advice from you, but I because I remember having this conversation a few years ago, and it was before I was practicing more open-mindedness. And she asked, what's your success rate? And it was we had just talked about this. Stanton started the life process program in early 2000s, and, like abstinence was success. So they followed up. It was some ridiculously high success rate, but really, if you looked at what they're measuring, Stanton is the first to say, but who cares? Because they would call a month, 6 months out, and are you still not using drugs? And people, surveys, and some high percentage of people would say, no, I'm not using drugs anymore. But when Stanton brought the program online, he talked about, I don't know, that's not a good metric for success. We want to know, are people living functional, good, balanced, healthful lives, and did the program help that? Anyway, how do you frame that, and how do you help people define it?
So it's a huge conversation across behavioral health and across the US right now, right? And one of the reasons is that no one has really defined it consistently. I mean, SAMHSA doesn't even have definitions on what good care outcomes are. So everyone's kind of hemmed and hawed for a while and said, well, we don't know. So we just can't track it. It's shifted in the past year. And I mean, we push clinical outcome tracking for everything, because at the end of the day, what I want is a clinically informed feedback loop, right? Because I know that works, and the payers know it works too, right? And so the first piece is, if you start tracking care, I mean, if you don't know what your baselines is, you don't know if you're doing better or worse, right? You don't know if you're improving or not improving. So just the fact that you start tracking any kind of outcomes at all, whatever you choose, as long as you track it, your care will improve. So the first step is just to start tracking something, right? Then what you track, I mean, sometimes it comes down to the philosophy of your program, right? For some programs, abstinence is the goal, and lengths of abstinence, after recovery, length between relapse or a number of relapses is a goal for them. If you look at the payer side, the payers are looking for very specific information. The payers are looking to reduce cost, right? And so they know a couple things that work. Connecting to employment is one. Medication compliance is two. ER visits is three. And a connection to a PCP is four. So those are the things that the payers are looking for. And so we tell a lot of clients that those are pretty good baselines, because you can make the assumption if they're connected to employment or going back into education, if they're staying out of the ER, if they're connected to a PCP, if they're compliant with any medications that they're on, that they're probably having a better life. Things are moving forward. So that's a good starting point. We like to measure just improvements in mood, right? And so your PHQ-9 was, or your GAD-7 had this score. It's improved over time. It is useful to track the patient goals, right? So what's your goal? Do you want to stop use completely? Do you want to moderate? Are you achieving that goal? You were getting blackout drunk 7 nights a week. Now it's 5. Great. We're making improvement, right? Do you want to get that down to 3, or do you want to completely eliminate the blackouts and just have a couple beers, whatever it is?
So it could be something. It doesn't need to be something concrete. It could be something fluid, but
yes.
By saying, what level of improvement do you, whatever. You can ask a question about how people feel they've improved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no benchmark data, right? So we work with like Track9, for example. I'm a big fan of them. They're creating national data sets. SAMHSA is starting to come out with some stuff around this data sets. And the White House is actually focused on clinical outcomes as well. And the payers are going to drive it. At the end of the day, the payers want the outcomes. And so they're really pushing. And so that's going to force people to, as well as the shift to value-based care. So value-based care, you have to understand your downline risk. If I don't know the percentage of my patients that are regularly relapsing, right? Well, now that's a cost to me. I'm not fee for service. I have to eat that. So if I have patients coming back 3 times in a year and I have to eat that cost, that's a big deal. Now I'm not sustainable. I can't survive as a business, right? Because we're losing money. So I need to know what my outcomes are in that manner. So one, I can negotiate the appropriate contract, but then also 2, so I can mitigate some of that. So if we're getting 3 relapses a year, oh my God, what do we need to change our program? We need to make it better, right? And so, yeah, I think those are the big things, is just making sure that there's some kind of tracking in place, identifying what's important to you, identifying what's important to the payment structure, because that's how you stay and help more people, and just slowly build it. And I think these outcomes will start to come together. There are a lot of tools being developed too from an app standpoint, right, that are tracking these things in general. So a lot more sophistication around tracking mood and engagement on the platforms that are less reliant on just patient statements. Because, to your point and Stanton's point, how reliable is it, right? Patient says, I'm not using, well, how many people want to say, oh yeah, I got drunk last night? You're not going to tell your rehab provider that.
or and I know that you understand the other side of that coin, which is, maybe they're completely honest, but their lives suck, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I have a couple more things I wanted to ask about, and then floor is free for as long as we think that there's salient conversation. But I'm curious. I think that the way you think about things, think through things logically, or at least the way that you write about them, so the conclusions you come to will yield very helpful for this question. What are the issues that you see in scaling an ethical practice, and what are some solid ways that you found to overcome them? For instance, I can say, if I'm a single provider, I can be pretty confident, if I'm seeing 4, 5, 6, 7 people a day, whatever it is, that I have a way about me. I can pretty much assure that the conversations are going to go a certain way. I can say that I'm a Rogerian kind of a person, but I teach skills and I can commit to that, and we can track that across time. And if I am 2 people, then all of a sudden now we have a complication. We may be on the same page, but we still have maybe different temperamental preferences and maybe slightly different philosophies. If I'm an organization, now we have all those sorts of problems. And then if I'm an organization that has to also adhere to legal standards about treatment and addiction, some of which may contradict our own philosophies, if we don't do it right. I know that you understand that, but just to give a baseline, it seems like the complexity could be endless.
Yeah. There's so much to go into on balance, right? It's definitely one of those things that aren't black and white. Like, we get into it in that area, when people are talking about like a mom and pop provider is someone that started their own facility, and maybe they started it just themselves giving therapy, and then eventually got a couple other people working for them, and they help, they're 30 beds or something like that now, right? So it's seeing 30 patients a month at a residential level. And then you've got private equity backed businesses, our providers got 800,000 beds across the country. That's a very different system, but then people get concerned about the philosophy, right? Because private equity definitely has a financial goal in place, right? And they're looking at the revenue and maximizing that. Whereas the clinical provider, the money is important, but it's probably not as critical to them as long as they have a lifestyle business and, can feed their kids and take a vacation from time to time, they're fine. whereas the private equity is much more driven. So you get into different pros and cons with the different levels of care and the different types of providers, right? So like when we go into a lot of the mom and pops and the small providers, they're very disorganized. They don't have clear systems and processes in place. It's not consistent, the level of care that they're providing. Sometimes there's a lack of sophistication within the clinical matrices, their curriculum. There's no training for new therapists coming on. So I mean, just as a simple example, right? If I'm the only therapist, I'm starting my own program, and I'm seeing patients all day, every day, and I hire a second therapist. Well, now I'm also answering the phone. I'm also doing accounting and taxes, right? I'm like trying to do everything myself. I don't have time to train that person. I don't have time for supervision. I don't even know what's going on over there in their sessions, right? So there's a lack of quality control in small providers as well. But they tend to have heart. They tend to be very focused on the patient. They tend to care, Whereas if you get into like a large private equity backed or a scaled provider, lots of systems and processes, right? They've got clear onboarding and recruitment structures. And so people get, sophisticated training before they start. They get ongoing supervision throughout the program to improve the quality of care. They've also got data and benchmarks, right? Or ideally, that's a little bit lacking in the space. But like Rogers Behavioral Health does a great job with this, right? They do a lot of data and tracking. And so they're able to do that as a large system. They're seeing thousands of patients, across their continuum of care every month. They can run that data analysis and say, hey, this works and this doesn't. This is really good and this isn't, and then implement it as much as they can system-wide, whereas a small provider is never going to be able to have that level of sophistication. Bigger systems can basically create scalable backends, right? And so I can create a back office that does billing, that does marketing, that does recruitment, right? And that's cost effective more so than you having to hire someone to do that stuff in your business, right? It's not very scalable. So as you get these economies of scale in place, then I have more money that's available to devote to training, to devote to paying higher salaries, to get higher quality clinicians in, to devote to creating a better clinical program. So, I mean, the more revenue you have, right, the more income you have to be able to devote to clinical care and better programming and certain levels of standardization. At the end of the day, like if I go to McDonald's, for speed and an okay burger, right? And low cost, right? That's what I expect to get. I don't care about service. I don't go out there for good service. I go there for these specific things. I know I get it almost every time I go. It's the same reason people go to Starbucks, right? So at scale, you can provide a standard of quality that's maintained that is much harder to do with a smaller provider. So on all those levels, I think it's important to look at the pros and cons and what you're doing. And then how do you scale? I mean, you have to, very simply, right? You have to have more patients than you have cost. And you have to make sure that you're getting that billed correctly, because reimbursement's a big struggle within healthcare. But it's localization, making sure that you're very strong, well recognized within the local community, maintaining good, strong referral relationships, especially related to patient care. Are you updating people? Are you letting them know what's going on with patients? Can you integrate that continuum of care? So the more that you can bring in and connect with their PCP, that can connect with the hospital system that they're maybe going into, connect with any specialty care providers they have, that stuff is all really valuable. Other things that work, I mean, obviously optimizing your marketing so you're not wasting money. A lot of people spend too much money on marketing and they don't get the return on it. And then if you're spending too much on marketing, then you can't use that money for the clinical program, right? But you have to market. A lot of programs can't scale because they don't, and they have this, feeling that it's not good or it's dirty. Well, that's why you're small. That's why you're only going to help 30 people, and so that's a choice. But like for me, and the way that this was a big shift for me in my own life, because I used to teach and I used to be like, oh, I don't want to be corporate and a manager and deal with that money. That's all dirty, right?
Exactly.
But then I realized I was moving from helping 30 kids in a classroom to 1,000 people in a school.
Right.
And we do the same thing at Circle Social, right? We field about 10,000 calls a month across our providers, in 100 plus facilities. We have a massive impact on the space, right? Versus if we were small and just working with one or two clients, we wouldn't be able to have that impact. So I look at the size and scale of impact because that's important to me as a goal. It's not important for everyone. Some people just want a lifestyle. But yeah, that's us.
That's interesting. You mentioned McDonald's and Starbucks. I think about that a lot, and it's so consistent. It's fast. It's cost effective. So more or less, I guess Starbucks is kind of expensive for what it is, and that just shows you can market you could market ethically if you're something like that, based on the value that you're promising.
Yep,
And
that's right.
consistency with which, I mean, one of the outcomes that McDonald's and Starbucks share is diarrhea. You know, like people don't probably feel well a lot of times after eating it or drinking it respectively,
Sure.
but they'll still pony up for it knowing that outcome. So, you
Right.
know,
Right.
you can feel anything if you're if you narrow in on it.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. I mean, we say all the time, like your value proposition is not always quality or service, right? Like Walmart's, it's low cost, right? We give the lowest cost, and their scale has allowed them to do that, right? The massive network that they've created allows them to reduce costs below what a local, downtown store can do. And people choose with their wallets, and they go to the cheaper place. Some people will pay more for better service or personalized service, but most people want to save money. And so that's what Walmart markets. You can think of the image of the rolling back prices and the little smiley face, right? That's what they market. They don't say, hey, you're gonna get the best service in the world here. They say, hey, you're gonna get the lowest prices. And
you also hit on something that crucial to just the way I think about things. I have been caught in this trap before where I rationalize, well, like you said, I don't want to go corporate. And there's sometimes where I look at, the whole picture of something that an offer that I've been made to do some kind of work. And I think, well, it does seem to oppose some of my, sacred values to do this work, but, maybe I can do it in a way that changes the landscape up a little bit. And a heuristic that I use is, if something is already a system, unless I'm tasked with overhauling it, I generally don't go into that space. Even if I have that idea, maybe I can change it up, or maybe I could be an ethical person in that. That might be wrong. That might not be sort of my best interest. But do you have heuristics that you use or consult other people to use when they're trying to get into that next paradigm? You know what I mean? For me, it's always just about weighing the costs and benefits of the decision, right? So give a good example that I was dealing with internally fairly recently here at Circle Social was content writers. We write a lot of content, right? We're pushing out 100 plus blogs a month sometimes. And they tend to be very creative types, right? And they have a certain way that they use to create and write content. And for a long time, I kind of let that go because that was my department heads, right? The content marketing manager kept saying, well, these are creative types. We got to let them kind of have their space. But it was preventing us from being able to grow that department and operate well. Because everyone was doing something differently, and they were all on different timelines, and we couldn't put any systems or processes or training in place, right? So finally I said, no, we have to standardize this. And so I said, what's going to happen is everyone's going to write an outline, and here's how the outlines are done, and then here we send it to approval, then it goes back, and then we write the piece of content that goes to the copy editor, that comes back, and we put that system in place, and it's been game changing. So it was us looking and saying, okay, look, this is a growth pain point that we cannot help more people if we can't solve this. And so for me, the benefit because you're losing some creativity in it, right? You're losing some comfort level with the staff, right? They're a little bit less happy. And you're losing some of the creativity because you're templating things. But the outcomes that we got with it are better than if we hadn't. Great point. So lastly, I'm interested to know what you think about online therapeutic programs. We talked a lot about residential spaces or physical brick and mortar places. Being in it, and of course, there's a selection bias of one it seems it proves very valuable, especially if there's an element of there's more or less passive work, passive in the sense of you're not talking to someone in the moment. If people have an opportunity to write about themselves, for instance, and then you add the element of being able to respond to that writing, and then add on to the element of, if you want to kind of talk about some of the summarizations that happen, you can then have a face-to-face. It seems all encompassing. And of course, speaking of cost benefit, you do lose, the water cooler type of interactions you might get at a physical location. But what do you think about, first of all, just the philosophy behind online programs, and then also what are your thoughts about the present and future of online programs and their success and what they could become? Yeah, like a lot of the conversations here, pros and cons, right? We see people preferring online
for outpatient behavioral therapy. So if I'm going in once a week to see a therapist, we see 70 to 90%, depending on the provider, preferring telehealth still. Especially, so it's good access. So that's one of the positives, right? If I'm in Seattle, like we have a large client in Seattle, I don't want to drive 45 minutes into town to see my therapist and then 45 minutes back in rush hour traffic, right? So I just lost an hour and a half plus the hour for my therapist. That doesn't make sense for me. So it's really valuable for me for telehealth. But once we get up to intensive outpatient, like IOP levels of care, where you're doing 3 hours a day, people want face-to-face, and most about 50-50. You get about 50, at least 50% want face-to-face, and we're seeing more and more, especially as the kind of COVID concerns have died down, that's shifting to a majority want face-to-face. And then if you get up to higher levels of care, then everyone wants face-to-face. No one wants to do residential or PHP telehealth, right? So then does it work, right? And I think the research is still out on that. I think people are coming back and forth with it. I look at it again from barriers and access to care, right? So some people, they don't want to get on a screen. They don't want to see someone. They don't feel comfortable. They want to text, right? And if that's an entry point, I think that's great, right? And then if you think it's appropriate as a clinician or a therapist to, get face-to-face time with them or whatever, or improve that level of care to a higher level, then definitely encourage them. But at least you got them in the door. Whereas otherwise they might not have access care at all, right? But yeah, I think those are the big things. And then cost, at the end of the day, like if I had my perfect world, right, it would be the ability to deliver great care at the lowest possible cost. And telehealth does obviously facilitate a lower cost structure. So that's valuable to a good portion of patients, especially if you get into the Medicaid space or rural spaces where, no one has cars or they can't drive or it's too far away. So those are really beneficial. But definitely higher level of acuity. I see the value in face-to-face. And I moved our company virtual in 2018, so before the pandemic, and I lose a lot. Yeah, I mean, you lose all those informal mentoring opportunities. You lose the informal chats and the water cooler talk, and a lot of value comes out of that. And we actually I just had my old content marketing manager. He quit because he couldn't handle the isolation, right? He's like, look, I need to work somewhere where there's people, where I can talk to people and see people. That's not just Zoom. Like, this isn't working for me. And so some people love working from home, right? But I've definitely seen the other side, that being a recent example where, I'm an extrovert, and fortunately on the consulting side, I travel a lot. So even though I work from home, I'm on the road, I'm talking to people all the time, so I get that need fulfilled. I couldn't imagine having to work at home all day, every day, though, and not see people in person.
I'm an introvert, and I thought after I was done being terrified, I thought I would absolutely love, I was like, maybe I could do this for a while. But I'm even the same way. Like I value deep conversation and meaningful conversations with people. And I think that can align with an introvert. So yeah, you're missing a lot in that sense. So I guess it wouldn't be sustainable if the whole world was online only.
I agree. And, Zoom is so intentional, right? Like, we're doing this podcast, and so let's get on a Zoom call, have the conversation, and let's finish it, right? Which is so different from like just saying, hey man, you going to lunch? You want to go with me? And just the random conversations and the relationships that can be built there. Even the conference scene, like I thought conferences were dying, 2018, 2019. I'm like, I don't know why we do these anymore. We can do it all online. And God, did I miss them.
Yeah.
So.
Given what you know about the work that I do and some of the things I've been asking about, do you think that I've missed anything that's of interest of you, either to talk about or to just go at it about, especially given your skill set and all of the knowledge that you have?
Well, I guess if we can flip the tables, I'm really curious in your perspective on delivering quality treatment, right? So, you've got the life process program, you've done a lot of work with Stanton. I know you do a lot of work with children and adolescents, and you see a lot of the same problems, I think, that I see in the space in terms of delivery and effective care. So from your perspective, what do you think really works and maybe what works that isn't being implemented so well in most places?
Man, you said a couple things when we were just talking that interested me. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately is trying to define abstract spaces, abstract phenomena that seem to work in terms of improving human beings and developing. I mean, like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development was a good way to talk about, concretize an abstract sort of a phenomenon. You know, kids a player a head taller than themselves, I think is what the quote was. So I've noticed that being able to be in touch with a person in a motivational interviewing way, whether it's a kid that I work with or a client, an adult client, there are people that I've worked with, and I think I'm absorbing some of the ability to do this, who have a knack for simply putting themselves in people's shoes. Not the putting themselves in people's shoes that follows a script, the putting themselves in people's shoes where, for the first time, sometimes somebody's been feeling listened to, valued, like, oh, I'm not insane. I'm not so idiosyncratic that I may as well kill myself, or whatever it is. And it doesn't need to go that deep. But anyway, I think what doesn't work is that people are, to make things easier on themselves and to get through the day, people divide into departments, and then people do in those departments what they have been taught is best practice, and they sort of impose that on other human beings.
Yeah.
As opposed to doing the exact opposite. The exact opposite is a bit harder to define and operationalize if it's harder to talk about. And so that doesn't exactly answer your question about what works and doesn't work, but it's the thing I'm trying to hone in on and talk about more and put language to, so that I can democratize it.
I think that's interesting, right? So like so both with the therapy program I do, but also back when I used to do teacher training, the biggest thing to get people to do it was to understand the people in the room, right? And not template things. And so there's this tendency where we want things done for us because it makes it easier, right? I mean, the easier our work can be, the better. And so I want the curriculum. I want you to tell me step by step how to do this lesson or how to deliver this group, right? Tell me what to do. I mean, even with programs that don't have good structure and don't have good clinical structure, like they'll have a topic or list or something, right? And then what most therapists do is they just go to Google and they print off like the first thing they see from one of the top 3 search results, and then they read it and pass it around or whatever, you know. It's very unstructured, but they want something kind of easy and templated. And so what we do in the therapeutic training, as well as what I used to do with teachers, is I take away all their stuff. I take away their tests, I take away their worksheets, I take away their curriculum. And I say, I want you to run activities here and get to know your students and figure out what their strengths and their weaknesses are. Once you understand that, then I want you to develop additional activities and learning opportunities to help them get better. And then I need you to have an assessment system in place. And that assessment system is really most of the time, just do it, right?
Yeah.
Show me that you can do this thing. That will tell you if they can do the thing, right? You don't need to create some elaborate assessment, right? Just ask them to do it. So like I statements are a really easy one, right? Here's a sentence, or let's have a conversation and make sure you use your I statements. If you can't do it, well, then I either haven't instructed it well, or, you know, we need more practice. So taking that away, I've found to be insanely effective, because then they really start to look at the people in the room. They start to understand their own strengths and weaknesses, but they're critical about it. They're like, okay, that worked. What I did worked. They got it. Or what I did didn't work. They didn't get it. Why didn't they get it? Why, I got to figure this out. And so after they've done that for a month or two, then I'll give them back their curriculums and all their worksheets and stuff, right? But what happens is then they look at it very differently, and they say, okay, well, this particular activity, I don't think is actually the best for the particular patients I have based on what I know. I'm going to change it. I'm going to switch it out. I'm going to modify it. So, you know, that entire idea of, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, saying, where are my learners now? Then how do I do +1, right? +1. And I kind of keep taking them to the next level. As a teacher, that's a true skill set, or even as a therapist, is understanding where they're at and then what's reasonable and attainable, not putting a pie in the sky objective that everyone gets demotivated on, or we can't do, or it's too difficult. Structuring that and scaffolding that learning appropriately, I think is really, really hard. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, is how do you help people really look at the people in the room and then develop structured activities and interventions that then benefit that particular moment of time that you're in with those people.
I love that idea. When I do work at schools, I see I don't think I have anyone who I work with who I don't think is completely competent and maybe even exceeds that competence. But the effort allocation, it's going into a templated curriculum. And so I think that's a brilliant idea. If you could operationalize in public schools, say, the curriculum cleanse or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Where it's like you just use the skills that you have and you kind of remember why you got into that. I don't know because I haven't done this. I'm only hearing about it now. But I imagine you could kind of remember why you got into teaching in the first place. And I also am guessing, please tell me if this is the case, that I bet people after going back to a curriculum, first off, you said they'd look at it differently. Second, I bet they generate some of the ideas that were generated into that were part of that curriculum on their own.
Yes.
And that's why they see it differently, right? Because they see why that would be best practice in the first place. It just depends on to whom
exactly. They start to understand the thought process and the why behind that particular activity and why it was developed. And once they understand that, then they can say, okay, well, does that why make sense for the particular group that I'm working with, right? I mean, I think one of the things, and this I've seen in a lot of your comments and work, is people can learn anything, right? Like there is this misconception that, and you can get back into the whole kind of biomedical reductionism of behavioral and addiction. But you're not defined by your genes, right? DNA is not destiny. You can learn anything. Doesn't mean that maybe something for you is not a little bit harder than for the person next door. Just means you got to put in more time and more work than that person, right? But you can absolutely accomplish it if you really have the time and effort to put into it. Sometimes you need a good coach or a good teacher. I mean, that's why we go to therapists, right? I mean, I can teach myself CBT skills, but I'd prefer to maybe pay someone that does it really well already and then can help me get there faster, right? But I think we often forget that learning is not linear, right? It's not like this stair-step pattern. It's a very non-linear organic process a lot of the time. And you need a lot of repetition and a lot of different angles to approach things at to really help you conceptualize it, but then unconsciously automate that process. So yeah, I think just helping people understand that, hey, look, this is going to take time. It's not necessarily a linear process, it's organic. And if you can help people understand that flow and how to deal with the changing setting, that's more valuable than having preset curriculums for everything, right?
That's such a good, thanks for helping me put some language to that. Yeah, I think that's this interview. I bet there are going to be some questions people are watching where they didn't know what my question meant until you answered it. You do have a great way of explaining things functionally, and I appreciate it. So if people want to give value to people, if people wanted to access, any of the things you do, any of the consulting work that you do, how could people find you? And,
sure. So LinkedIn is a really great place to contact me. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So just shoot me a message. It's Nick Jaworski. You can find me by name. I'm more than happy for people to reach out through email though too. So if you want, my work email is nick@circlesocialinc.com. A lot of people, your brain will switch it because they're used to saying social circle. It's not, it's Circle Social Inc. It's a interesting brain process there. But yeah, email me anytime. Happy to walk you.
Here, my Lamborghini here.